Hashtag police officer mistaken a friendly neighbor for a thief. Watch the shocking moment. The sun was setting over Oakwood Heights, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Officer Lee had just finished his coffee when the radio in his patrol car crackled to life. He'd been working this neighborhood for 8 years now, and most days were pretty quiet. Most folks around here knew him by name, and he knew theirs too. That's what he loved about this job, building trust with the community, seeing the same friendly faces day after day. The streets were lined with tidy houses, front yards well kept with flowers blooming along the walkways. Kids' bikes leaned against porches, and the occasional dog would bark as Officer Lee's car rolled by. It was the kind of place where people still borrowed cups of sugar from next door and held block parties in the summer. All units near Maple Street, we have a report of suspicious activity at 427 Maple. Possible break-in in progress. The dispatcher's voice cut through Officer Lee's thoughts. He straightened up immediately. Unit 14 responding. I'm 2 minutes away. His mind quickly sorted through what he knew about 427 Maple. The Baker family lived there. Nice couple, 2 kids, and that fluffy white dog that always got excited when Officer Lee drove by. Wait, didn't Mrs. Baker mention something about a trip when he'd seen her at the grocery store last week? As Officer Lee turned onto Maple Street, he slowed his car and dimmed the headlights. The street was quiet, most windows glowing with warm light as families settled in for dinner. And there it was, 427 Maple, with most of its windows dark. But there was movement by the side of the house, a shadowy figure near the kitchen window. Officer Lee parked a few houses down and quietly stepped out of his car. The neighbor who had called in the report, an older woman watering flowers despite the dimming light, pointed wordlessly toward the Baker house. She mouthed they're on vacation and nodded firmly. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, sending leaves swirling around his feet as Officer Lee moved carefully toward the house. His hand rested lightly on his holster, not drawing his weapon, but ready. Through the years, he'd learned that most situations weren't as dangerous as they first appeared, but you could never be too careful. The figure by the window was trying to push it up higher, struggling with something in the hands. It looked like a man in a dark hoodie, definitely not Mr. Baker, who was short and balding. This person was taller with a bulky backpack. The window squeaked as it finally gave way, and the figure began to hoist himself up onto the ledge. Officer Lee's heart pounded. In 8 years of patrolling Oakwood Heights, he'd dealt with plenty of domestic disputes, a few drunk drivers, and the occasional shoplifter at the corner store. But a home invasion, that was rare in these parts. He moved closer, staying in the shadows of the tall oak trees that gave the neighborhood its name. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of a television from a nearby house and the continued scraping of the window as the figure struggled to climb in. Officer Lee took a deep breath. He trained for this. He knew the protocol. And in a small community like this, keeping everyone safe was personal. He thought of the Baker kids with their gap-toothed smiles who always waved at his patrol car. This is the police. Stop what you're doing and put your hands where I can see them. Officer Lee called out, his voice cutting through the evening quiet like a knife. The figure at the window froze, then suddenly lost balance. There was a crash from inside the house, the sound of something breaking. Several lights in neighboring houses flicked on. The peaceful Friday evening in Oakwood Heights was about to turn into something nobody expected, something that would have the whole town talking for months to come. Just 3 houses down from the Bakers lived a man who had only been in Oakwood Heights for 23 days. Dave had moved in last month, bringing with him 2 houseplants, a laptop, and enough enthusiasm to make up for his lack of furniture. His living room still had boxes labeled kitchen stuff and books stacked against the walls, but he'd set up his work desk by the sunniest window where he spent his days typing code for a company halfway across the country. Dave wasn't the kind of person who normally stood up in a crowd. Average height with glasses that slipped down his nose when he concentrated, he had the kind of face people thought they recognized even if they'd never met him before. But what Dave lacked in memorability, he made up for in friendliness. Within days of moving in, he'd met most of his neighbors, helped Mrs. Wu carry her groceries, and fixed the wobbly mailbox post for the retired couple across the street. The Bakers had been especially welcoming. When they noticed Dave eating takeout on his front porch for the 3rd night in a row, They invited him over for a home-cooked meal. Nobody should eat alone that much, Mrs. Baker had said, filling his plate with seconds before he'd even finished firsts. The kids had immediately dragged him to the backyard to see their treehouse, and even their fluffy white dog had approved, falling asleep on Dave's feet under the dinner table. That dinner had turned into weekly get-togethers. Dave would bring dessert, always store-bought, but nobody minded, and the Bakers would catch him up on neighborhood news, whose roses were winning awards, which houses were for sale, and who made the best potato salad at the summer block parties. So when the Bakers mentioned their upcoming trip to visit relatives, it seemed perfectly natural when Mr. Baker asked, "Hey Dave, would you mind checking in on the house while we're gone? Just water the plants and make sure Snowball doesn't destroy anything." "Sure thing," Dave had replied, genuinely happy to help. "I work from home anyway, so it's no trouble." On Thursday evening, the day before the Bakers left, Mrs. Baker had walked over with a spare key and a 3-page list of instructions. "Snowball needs her medicine twice a day," she'd explained, pointing to a paragraph about their cat's dietary needs. "And the fern in the kitchen is dramatic. If you don't water it by Thursday, it'll look dead, but don't panic, it'll perk right back up." Dave had carefully placed the key in his wallet between his driver's license and grocery store loyalty card. What he didn't know then was how quickly that simple act of neighborly kindness would turn into the most embarrassing moment of his life. Friday had gone smoothly. Dave had fed Snowball in the morning, watered the supposedly dramatic fern, and checked that all windows were closed because the weather forecast mentioned possible rain. Saturday afternoon, he'd grabbed his wallet and walked over to check on things again. After collecting the mail that had accumulated in the baker's box, Dave had set it on their kitchen counter. Then, as he filled Snowball's water bowl, he'd heard the distinct sound of his phone ringing back at his house. "Be right back," he told the cat, who ignored him completely in favor of grooming herself. Dave had jogged back to his house, answered an important work call, and then realized with a sinking feeling that he'd left his wallet with the baker's key on his coffee table. When he returned to the baker's house, he tried the door only to find it had locked behind him. Snowball watched him through the window, looking smugly amused at his predicament. After walking around the house, Dave had noticed the kitchen window was open a crack, probably his doing when he'd watered the plants earlier. It wasn't ideal, but it seemed like the only way in without breaking something. The cat needed her medicine after all, and he'd promised the Bakers he'd take care of things. "It'll be fine," Dave had muttered to himself as he hoisted the bag of cat food higher on his shoulder and approached the window. What's the worst that could happen? Dave pushed the kitchen window up as far as it would go, which wasn't very far. The old wooden frame creaked in protest, opening just enough for him to maybe squeeze through if he held his breath. He looked down at the bag of cat food in his hand and sighed. This was going to be tricky. "Okay, food first, then me," he muttered, tossing the bag through the narrow opening. It landed with a soft thud on the kitchen counter, sending a stack of mail fluttering to the floor. Snowball appeared instantly, as if teleported by the sound of potential food. Dave hoisted himself up, getting one arm through the window and trying to find something to grab onto. His legs dangled awkwardly, feet scrabbling against the brick exterior for any kind of foothold. He must look ridiculous, half in and half out of the window, like some kind of failed burglar. If any of the neighbors saw him like this, he'd never live it down. "Just a little more," Dave grunted, pulling himself forward inch by struggling inch. He was nearly through, his torso now balanced precariously on the windowsill, when he had it, footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves behind him. Before Dave could turn around, a stern voice cut through the evening air. "Police, don't move." The shock of it sent a jolt through Dave's body. His hands slipped on the counter he'd been gripping, and suddenly he was tumbling forward with nothing to stop him. He crashed through the window opening, knocking over Mrs. Baker's collection of herb plants as he landed in an ungraceful heap on the kitchen floor. Dirt scattered everywhere. A pot shattered. Snowball yelled and darted from the room, a white streak of fur and indignation. Dazed, Dave rolled onto his back, squinting at the silhouette of a police officer framed in the window, now pointing what looked terrifyingly like a gun at him. "I said don't move." Officer Lee commanded, his voice tight with tension. "Put your hands where I can see them. Now." Dave's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth went desultory as he slowly raised his trembling hands. "Wait, I can explain," he croaked, but Officer Lee was already climbing through the same window, moving with the practiced efficiency Dave had so badly lacked. "Roll onto your stomach, hands behind your back," Officer Lee ordered, keeping his gun trained on Dave. "But I'm supposed to be here," Dave protested, his voice rising in pitch. "I'm watching their cat. I'm their neighbor." The absurdity of the situation was sinking in, but the officer's expression remained stern and unmoved. "That's what they all say," Officer Lee replied, clearly having heard similar excuses before. "You can explain downtown. Right now, I need you to lie face down on the floor." With the gun still pointed at him, Dave had little choice. He turned over slowly, feeling bits of potting soil stick to his cheek as he pressed his face against the cold tile floor. This wasn't how he planned his Saturday evening. His glasses had been knocked askew in the fall, and now he could only see a blurry version of Snowball, who had returned to watch the proceedings from the doorway with feline disapproval. "I was just trying to feed the cat," Dave said, his words muffled against the floor. "Check my pocket. I have Mrs. Baker's list right here." "Stop talking and put your hands behind your back," Officer Lee said, kneeling down beside him. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around Dave's wrists, each snap sounding impossibly loud in the quiet kitchen. Outside, he could hear voices gathering, neighbors drawn by the commotion. Great, so much for making a good first impression in the neighborhood. "You've got the wrong idea," Dave tried again as Officer Lee helped him to his feet, still keeping a firm grip on his arm. "Just call the Bakers. They'll tell you." "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Lee began, reciting the familiar words that Dave had only ever heard on TV shows. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Officer Lee guided Dave through the Baker's living room, one hand firmly on his shoulder. Dave's glasses sat crooked on his nose, and dirt from the fallen plants still clung to his shirt. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just an hour ago, he'd been sitting at home, working on his computer, and now he was being arrested for breaking into his neighbor's house, the very house he promised to take care of. "This is all a big misunderstanding," Dave tried again as they approached the front door. Officer Lee paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Look, we'll sort everything out at the station. If you're telling the truth, you'll be home by dinner." When Officer Lee opened the door, Dave blinked in surprise. The quiet street had transformed. 3 police cars with flashing lights lined the curb. A small crowd of neighbors stood on the sidewalk, some in bathrobes, others still holding dinner forks or TV remotes, all craning their necks to see what was happening. And most alarming of all, at least a dozen phones were pointed directly at him, recording every humiliating second. "Is that the new guy?" Someone whispered loudly enough for Dave to hear. "I knew he seemed suspicious," another voice replied. "Always home during the day. Who does that?" "I work from home," Dave called out, his face burning with embarrassment. "I'm a software engineer." A second police officer approached, an older man with salt and pepper hair. "What have we got, Lee?" "Caught him climbing through the kitchen window," Officer Lee explained. "Says he's supposed to be watching the place while the owners are away." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "And you were entering through the window because—" "I locked myself out," Dave said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I left the key at my house. I'm just trying to feed their cat. Her name is Snowball. She needs medicine twice a day for her thyroid." He'd had this on him, Officer Lee said, holding up the bag of cat food he'd recovered from the kitchen counter. It seemed like such flimsy evidence in Dave's favor. Anyone could buy cat food. A third police car pulled up, its siren giving one final whoop before falling silent. The growing spectacle was bringing out more neighbors. Someone had even brought out a folding chair, as if settling in to watch a show. "That's Dave," a voice suddenly called from the back of the crowd. A woman in her 60s pushed her way forward, still wearing oven mitts. It was Mrs. Wu from next door. "He helped me carry my groceries last week. He's not a burglar." Dave had never been so happy to see someone in his life. "Mrs. Wu, thank you. Can you tell them I'm watching the Baker's house?" Mrs. Wu nodded vigorously. "The Bakers asked him to take care of their cat. I saw them give him the key before they left." Officer Lee and the older officer exchanged looks. "Do you have ID on you?" the older officer asked Dave. "In my wallet, at my house," Dave replied, nodding down the street. 3 doors down. The blue house with the broken mailbox. We should check his story, the older officer suggested quietly. But before Officer Lee could respond, a teenage boy pushed to the front of the crowd, his phone held high. "I've got the Bakers right here. On video chat. They want to talk to you guys." The crowd parted as the teenager approached, his phone screen showing Mr. Baker's confused face. "What's going on at our house? Tyler just texted us that there are police cars everywhere." Officer Lee took the phone, his expression now uncertain. "Sir, we responded to a call about a possible break-in at your residence. We found this man entering through your kitchen window." The phone's speaker crackled as Mr. Baker's voice came through. "Is he wearing a blue shirt? Glasses? That's Dave. He's supposed to be there. We asked him to watch our house and take care of Snowball." Officer Lee's face fell. He looked at Dave, then back at the phone, then at the growing crowd of neighbors, all still recording. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. "Well, this is awkward," muttered the older officer, not quite under his breath. Officer Lee stood frozen for a moment, Mr. Baker's words hanging in the air. The crowd of neighbors had gone quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Dave tried to stand tall despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists and the growing certainty that this video would probably end up online before midnight. "Could you repeat that, sir?" Officer Lee asked into the phone, his voice unnaturally stiff. "That's Dave," Mr. Baker repeated, sounding increasingly confused. "He's our neighbor. We asked him to feed our cat and water the plants while we're gone. Is everything okay?" Officer Lee's face flushed red. He glanced at Dave, then at the crowd, then back at the phone. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, sir." "A misunderstanding?" Mrs. Baker's voice joined in, her face appearing next to her husband's on the small screen. "What kind of misunderstanding involves police cars at our house?" "Someone reported a break-in," Officer Lee explained, each word clearly painful to say. "When we arrived, we found your neighbor climbing through the kitchen window." "Oh." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Baker's voice. "Dave, did you lock yourself out? I told you we keep a spare key under the flower pot by the garage." Dave blinked. "You do? You never mentioned that." "It's on page 2 of my instructions," Mrs. Baker said, "right after the part about Snowball's special food bowl." Dave would have slapped his forehead if his hands weren't still cuffed behind his back. "I only read page 1, he admitted. Mr. Baker chuckled. "Well, that explains it. Officer, Dave has our full permission to be in our home. He's doing us a favor." The older police officer stepped forward, keys jingling in his hand. "Let's get those cuffs off you, son," he said quietly to Dave. As he unlocked the handcuffs, he added, "Sorry about the confusion." Dave rubbed his wrists, relief washing over him. "It's fine. You were just doing your job." But it wasn't entirely fine. The neighbors were still watching. Some had lowered their phones, but others were still recording. Someone in the back of the crowd was live streaming the whole thing, narrating in an excited whisper. An elderly woman with a floral headscarf pushed through the crowd. It was Mrs. Puttle from across the street, walking with her cane but moving with surprising determination. "I called the police," she announced, her chin raised defiantly. "I saw a strange man breaking into my neighbor's home. What was I supposed to think?" Officer Lee seemed to shrink under her gaze. "You did the right thing, ma'am. We always want citizens to report suspicious activity." "But this young man wasn't doing anything wrong," she continued, turning to Dave. "I owe you an apology, dear." Dave shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "No, really, it's okay. Better safe than sorry, right? If I'd been a real burglar, you would have been a hero." Mrs. Patel considered this, then nodded, seeming satisfied. She turned back to Officer Lee with a stern expression, "But you should have asked more questions before putting handcuffs on him." The crowd murmured in agreement. Officer Lee's discomfort was visible as all eyes turned to him. The teenager still held his phone up, the Bakers watching the entire scene unfold. "You're right," Officer Lee admitted, his voice carrying across the now quiet crowd. He turned to Dave. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. I should have verified your story before taking action." The sincerity in his voice surprised Dave. He'd expected excuses or official-sounding explanations about protocol. Instead, he got a genuine apology. "I accept your apology," Dave said, extending his hand. Officer Lee shook it firmly, gratitude visible in his eyes. Someone in the crowd started clapping, and suddenly everyone was applauding. The tension broke like a fever, replaced by a strange sense of community. Now that that's settled, came Mrs. Baker's voice from the phone. Could someone please make sure Snowball got her evening medicine? She gets very cranky when her schedule is disrupted. The crowd laughed, and even Officer Lee cracked a smile. Dave felt the weight of embarrassment lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't exactly how he planned to meet his neighbors, but at least they'd never forget his name now. The police cars eventually pulled away, their lights no longer flashing, but the crowd lingered. Some neighbors had brought out folding chairs. Others returned from their homes with trays of cookies and pitchers of lemonade. What had started as a potential crime scene had somehow transformed into an impromptu block party on the Bakers' front lawn. Dave sat on the porch steps, a paper cup of lemonade in his hand, retelling the story for the 5th time to a fresh group of neighbors who had just arrived, drawn by text messages and social media alerts. So there I was, halfway through the window, he explained, using his free hand to demonstrate his awkward position. And then I hear police. Don't move. And I just. He mimicked losing his grip and tumbling forward, careful not to spill his drink. The neighbors laughed, and Dave found himself laughing along with them. It was funny now, in retrospect, though it certainly hadn't felt that way an hour ago. Officer Lee had stayed too, after the other police officers left. He'd removed his hat and jacket in the evening warmth and accepted a cookie from someone's grandmother. Now he leaned against his patrol car, shaking his head as he watched Dave's animated storytelling. "He's taking it pretty well," said the teenager who'd saved the day with his video call. He stood next to Officer Lee, still filming occasionally for his social media accounts. "Better than I would," Officer Lee admitted. "Getting arrested in front of your new neighbors isn't exactly the welcome wagon I'd want." "At least you didn't tase him," the teen offered helpfully. Officer Lee winced. "Not helping, kid." Across the lawn, Mrs. Patel had taken a seat in a lawn chair someone had brought out for her. She was holding court with several other older neighbors, all of them discussing the Neighborhood Watch program they'd apparently been meaning to start for years. "We need better communication," Mrs. Patel insisted. "If I had known the Bakers asked someone to watch their house, I wouldn't have called the police." "We could start a group chat," suggested another neighbor. "My grandson set one up for my knitting circle. It's very handy." Officer Lee pushed himself away from his car and walked over to where Dave was sitting. The crowd around Dave quieted as the officer approached. "Mind if I join you?" Officer Lee asked, gesturing to the empty space on the step. Dave scooted over. "Free country, even for people who've arrested me." A few neighbors chuckled nervously, but Officer Lee smiled, taking the joke as it was intended. He sat down heavily, setting his hat beside him. "I wanted to apologize again," he said, more officially this time, without an audience. He glanced at the neighbors still watching them and sighed. "Well, with less of an audience anyway." Dave shrugged. "Like I said before, you were doing your job." "I probably would have done the same thing if I saw someone climbing through a window." "Still, I should have listened better," Officer Lee said. "Instead of just assuming." Dave nodded, understanding what the officer wasn't saying. A new guy in the neighborhood, someone nobody knew well yet, it was easy to jump to conclusions. "Tell you what," Dave said. "How about we both forget it happened and start over?" He stuck out his hand. "Hi, I'm Dave. I just moved in 3 weeks ago." Officer Lee looked at the offered hand, then shook it firmly. "I'm Tom Lee. Been patrolling this neighborhood for 8 years now." A flash went off nearby, someone taking a picture of their handshake. Both men blinked in surprise. "Sorry," said a woman with a local newspaper badge hanging around her neck. "But this is going to make a great story for Tuesday's edition. Local officer and mistaken burglar make peace. Can I get a quote from each of you?" A toast, he called out, to good neighbors, understanding police officers, and to Snowball, who needed her medicine just badly enough to create the best thing that ever happened to our little street. Everyone cheered and raised their cups. Dave looked around at the faces of people who had been strangers 6 months ago, but were now friends. Sometimes, he thought, the most embarrassing moments in life turned out to be the most important ones. "Next time you go out of town," he said to the Bakers, "I promise to use the spare key." Dave and Officer Lee exchanged looks of alarm. "The newspaper?" "You're going to put this in the newspaper?" Dave asked. The reporter nodded enthusiastically. "It's not often we get such a heartwarming story. Usually, it's just council meetings and high school sports." "I don't think my boss is going to find this heartwarming," Officer Lee muttered. "Oh, he already knows," the reporter said cheerfully. "He told me to come down here when the calls started coming into the station. Said it would be good community relations to show how Oakwood's finest can admit when they make a mistake." Officer Lee's expression suggested he had a different opinion about that, but he kept it to himself. 6 months later, the baker's backyard was filled with the smell of grilling burgers and the sound of laughter. Colorful paper lanterns hung from trees, and folding tables covered with red and white checkered cloths dotted the lawn. Nearly everyone from Maple Street has shown up for what had become known as the Great Misunderstanding Cookout. Dave flipped burgers on the grill, wearing an apron that read, "Not a burglar," a gag gift from his co-workers after the newspaper story had gone viral. The local article had been picked up by national news outlets, and for a few wild days, Dave had found himself doing interviews over video chat during his lunch breaks. His 15 minutes of fame had included an appearance on a morning show and countless memes online. "Need any help with those burgers?" Officer Lee asked, approaching with 2 cold sodas. He was dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, looking very different from the stern police officer who had handcuffed Dave half a year ago. "I think I can handle it," Dave replied with a grin, accepting one of the sodas. "Unless you want to frisk these paddies for concealed weapons." Their joking relationship had become a neighborhood staple. The initial awkwardness had faded after a few weeks, replaced by a genuine friendship that surprised them both. "Very funny," Officer Lee said, taking a sip of his drink. "You know, the new recruits at the station still ask me to tell the story. It's part of their training now, how not to jump to conclusions 101. "Glad to be a teaching moment," Dave said, flipping another burger. "Though I still say the real hero was Snowball. If she hadn't needed her medicine, none of this would have happened." As if hearing her name, the fluffy white cat sauntered across the lawn, accepting pets from guests before settling in a patch of sunlight. She had become something of a celebrity herself, with her own social media account run by the Baker children. Mrs. Patel approached the grill, leaning on her cane but moving with more energy than she had 6 months ago. The neighborhood watch program she had started after the incident had given her a new purpose. She wore the official vest even now at a social gathering. "David, dear, when you're done with those burgers, we need to discuss the schedule for next month's patrols," she said. "Officer Lee has offered to give us another training session on how to properly report suspicious activity." Without jumping to conclusions, Officer Lee added with a meaningful look, "We only call the real police as a last resort now," Mrs. Patel said proudly. "First, we post in the group chat. It's saved us quite a few false alarms. Like when Mr. Wilson's teenage son came home at midnight and forgot his key," Dave asked. "Exactly," Mrs. Patel beamed. "Instead of calling 911, I posted in the chat, and his mother confirmed it was just her son being forgetful again." At the dessert table, Mrs. Baker was cutting her famous chocolate cake, the same one she brought to Dave's house the day after the incident as a thank you for taking such dedicated care of Snowball, even if it had resulted in his arrest. "Who wants cake?" she called out, and a line quickly formed. Mr. Baker stood at the front of the yard, attaching a banner to 2 trees. It read Oakwood Heights, where we turn mistakes into block parties. He'd had it made specially for today's gathering. As the afternoon sun began to lower, someone brought out a projector and a white sheet. The neighborhood kids had put together a short movie about the incident, complete with dramatic reenactments using action figures and hand-drawn backgrounds. They'd interviewed everyone involved, creating a surprisingly touching documentary about how one misunderstanding had brought an entire community together. Dave and Officer Lee sat side by side on lawn chairs as the movie began, both cringing good-naturedly at the exaggerated portrayals of themselves. "Do I really sound that serious?" Officer Lee whispered as a child playing him delivered his lines in a comically deep voice. "At least they didn't show me falling through the window in slow motion," Dave whispered back. When the film ended, showing real footage of today's gathering, everyone applauded. Mr. Baker stood up, raising his paper cup.